This time I wanted to talk to you about logging messages and exceptions. A little bit of a dry subject, but this is something I want to talk about because it's something that I found myself writing lots of code to do, and I just wanted to make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to hopefully show you some methods that will make it a little bit easier for your applications. In fact, I'm going to specifically talk about two, I was going to call them plugins, but not one logger and one plugin, and they go hand in hand, but we'll come on to those in a second. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to do a quick recap first of how Dancer does its logging and how you might use the Dancer logger. I'm then going to look at the logger log report. I'm then going to go and look at the plugin log report, and we'll see how those are related. And then I'm going to talk about, well, give a sort of overview of how you might handle errors normally within your application. There's obviously a number of ways to do that. And then I'm going to show how you can do that with plugin log report if you want to. And then finally, I'm going to touch on translations. But first, I'm going to talk about, well, that's the question why we want to do this. I sort of already touched on that really. I found that when I first started using Dancer, I was using the logging engine, but actually I found there's quite a close relationship between stuff you might want to log to a system logger for your sysadmins and stuff you might want to send to the user. You know, so some warnings you might want to send to the system, some you might want to send to the user, and some you might want to do both. And I thought there must be a better way of sort of joining these together. I also wanted to easily catch user errors. I found I was writing a lot of code just to test for a user doing something wrong, displaying that error to the user, and then actioning something accordingly. And like all of us, I want to keep my code to a minimum. I don't like writing the same thing over and over again. So just a quick recap first. Default Dancer logging, I'm sure you'll have all seen this. There's a number of Dancer keywords, call, debug, info, warning, error. You call any of those from your Dancer application, it'll go to your Dancer logger, and it'll get down with it accordingly. And that works well. That's absolutely fine. The only one sort of real disadvantage I can come up with for that is that if you've got an external module and you want to send to your logger, you need to use Dancer within that external module. I think I'm correct in saying. So it might be you've got a generic module that you want to do some logging in and send that to your Dancer logger. So to get around that, you can use a log report. It's very easy to get up and running. Just obviously install off cpan and just specify log report as your logger. By default, it will behave the same way as your Dancer logger, so by default, it will just send it to the console. So that's a very quick and easy way to get it up and running. But just from doing that, you can then use. In fact, this is all built on a module called log report, and from that, you can use log report and then your external modules, and you don't need those modules to depend on Dancer. You can then use any of the log report logging functions and send it to your Dancer logger. The way the logger, I don't want to go into too much detail on log report. It's a very comprehensive logging engine. It's fairly lightweight, but it's actually quite comprehensive as well. And with log report, you can have a lot of dispatches. So dispatches is a bit like your Dancer logging engines, but like I say, they can apply to other modules other than your Dancer application. So there's quite a few available. Just to give some examples, you've got a syslog dispatcher, a file dispatcher, a log from Perl dispatcher, and a callback dispatcher, where you can do any specific callback code with any of the logs. That also gives you the standard Dancer logging levels. It gives you some additional logging levels as well, which I'll look at in a second. And the way that dispatches work is that you can do all sorts of things with dispatches, and I'll look at a couple of them later on in the presentation. But one of the things you can do is filter on them. So you might want the dispatcher that's going to your console to display all your errors, including your debug. You might want your syslog dispatcher to only display messages above a certain level. And just very briefly, this is the log report concept. So you create messages on the left. They all become a log report message object, and then they go to dispatchers on the right. And what's worth mentioning as well now is that there's actually an exception object as well. The exception object contains a message object. So if you generate an exception, that actually contains a log report message. So and in that exception object, there's all sorts of other things you can do with it. So it really is quite a good system. In terms of the logging levels, these are all the logging levels available, probably more than most of us would use. But I'll just touch on some of them. Starting at the top, you've got a trace, which is very similar to your debug or messages, all the way to the end where you've got a panic, which is something's gone horribly wrong. The ones I mainly use are trace, notice, where I want to just note that something's happened. Success is a special, you won't see this in log report, success is a special keyword that's produced by this plugin for Dancer. And that's the same as a notice, but designed to tell the user that something successful has happened. Warning and mistakes sort of go hand in hand to say something's possibly gone wrong, but it's not fatal. And then the other two that I mainly use are error, which is a fatal condition, but it's a user fatal condition, so it's not something I personally as a sysadmin would be bothered about, but it's still fatal. And panic, which is where it's fatal, but actually it's something that's gone wrong that I do want to know about. So what I've talked about till now is all log report. What I'm going to do now is talk about plugin log report, and you can use these. You can probably use these separately, but I would only ever use them together, I think. What plugin log report does is it gives you a whole bunch of additional functionality into your application that uses that log report backend. So it exports some keywords to your Dancer application, and it does a few other things as well, which I'm going to talk about now. The first thing it does is it automatically saves, so all those messages we've been talking about, it automatically saves those to a session variable, which you can then display from your template. Now it's configurable which ones it saves to your session variable, but by default it's ones above, I think, notice. Because of course your user isn't going to be interested in debug messages, but they're probably going to want to be interested in warning messages. And like I say, there's two different warning types. You've got warning and mistake. So it might be that you filter warnings to your syslogger, but mistake messages to your user, but that's all configurable. And then all you need to do is something like this. So very simple Dancer application, use the plugin, a very simple route, and all you do is call, for example, the notice keyword, which generates a notice message, and that adds the message, sends it to all your dispatchers, and also saves it to your session where you can then display it in your template. So I can very easily throughout my application just call these keywords. If I just want to tell the user that something's happened, I can just write notice and say something, and that is straight away available in my template with very little code. And to give you an example of how that's used, so onto my template, so I can just do what I normally do is in my layout, I just do a for each and all these session messages and display them. The message object, and this is just something I put in for me, so you might want to add other things, and I'm quite happy to take ideas. I've got a method called bootstrap color, which will show a suitable bootstrap color for that message. And that did, for those that know bootstrap, that will create a very nice looking, I'll show a demo in a second, that will create a nice looking sort of widget at the top of each page displaying these messages in a suitable color. So for probably half a dozen lines of code, I'm sending color-coded messages to the user. What the plugin also does is it handles application exceptions, and it does those in a couple of different ways depending on your environment. If it detects that you're running a development environment, i.e. show errors is 1, then it will just send that to the save messages session, and you'll see those as a developer using your application. If show errors is off, what it will do is send a generic error message to your user. So let's say it's something that's gone wrong with your application that's running in production. It'll send a generic error message to a user, and that's configurable, so it'll just say something like an error has occurred. But then into your dispatchers, into the syslogger, or whichever other dispatcher you're using, it'll have the full error message with a stack trace and a line number and so on if you want it. So the way that I use this in the production environment with my slightly flaky software is that I know that my exceptions, when I'm not expecting them, will get handled nicely to the end user, so they won't see any sort of unexpected behaviour. They'll just get a fairly sort of friendly error message, and then I get that alert on the server side, given the full details, so I can then investigate that. The mode of the dispatcher defines what to show. So and all that's in that message object I talked about. So it'll define whether you want to show the line number, whether you want to show the stack trace, and so on. So what I'll talk about now is the log report logger. I've talked about the log report plugin and just showing messages and how you pass messages easily to your user and to various parts of your system. What I'm going to talk about now is how to handle errors. And when I say errors, I mean sort of user errors that you're expecting in your application. So, for example, your user's put in an invalid email address. This is obviously there's a number of ways to do this. Here's a couple of examples. You could return the errors from your subroutine. I know people that do that. I don't like that method particularly myself. It gets a bit cumbersome. Or you can dive from your subroutine and try and catch that. This is how I used to. I used to use a module called ouch, which works well. I still found I was writing too much code, so I I had a dying on ouching, as it's called, from the subroutine, and then I was evaluating on something that I expected might go wrong, testing whether it had gone wrong, if it had gone wrong, displaying an error, and otherwise displaying a success message. And that works fine. I still got a couple of applications where that is still being used, but for me that was too much code. So plugin log report exports, well, first of all exports error, which I've already covered, and it also exports something called process, which is a bit like an eval. By default, if you just write error in your application anywhere, the application will die, but die in a sort of clean way and display that error to the user. If you're expecting that to happen, you can use process to catch that, and it's very minimal code, so I'll give you an example of that now. So that code that you saw before is sort of replaced by this, so I just say if process this particular subroutine, that will return true or false depending on whether that was successful. If it was successful, then I use a success message just to tell my user that it was, in this example, created successfully, and that message will go to my messages session variable and be displayed on my web page with no other code required. And if it wasn't, the error is actually handled automatically. Because you've called error, that error message will have gone to your dispatchers, and that will also go to your web page without you having to do anything else in your code here. I'll just give a slightly fuller example of that. So this is what I do quite a lot of my code. I don't know how other people do it. So if I've got a particular route that I might get a get or a post, first of all, I get the current settings. I'm just using settings as an example here. Yeah, so get my current settings first. If I see that they've submitted an update, then I set all those settings in that settings object to their new values. I then try and write those new values, and that's where all the tests occur. So there might be several tests in there to check to validate the data. If that comes back as a true value, I then just set a success message, and I know that that's going to get passed to the web page. If that fails and it's false, like I say, the error message has already been handled and sent to the web page, and then that's the end of my update. And then I then go back to the same page that the user was on. So by doing that, the user will have either received a success message or a fail message. And the important thing is that object has still got their inputted values in, so the user will still get their bad values back on their web page, so that they know that they can, so they don't have to retype them all, which is obviously quite frustrating. So I've covered quite a lot of ground here. I hope I'm not going too fast. So I've covered login. I've covered the plugin report to send the messages. I've covered catching error messages from your user. And finally, I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about translations, because I mean all this goes hand in hand really. Translations is probably one of those things that we worry about last, but actually, when you want to put that into your application, it's a whole lot of work. But the good thing about this plugin is you can actually do that as you go along the application and do your translations later. And to do that, you use these functions. I don't know how many people have seen this sort of terminology before. Oh, there we go. These are the translating functions. That's actually 2 underscores. So it's a function that's just 2 underscores. And that will signify that text is to be translated. You would normally precede this with a particular message. So whereas before I was saying success and then send a success error string, what you would do now is say success underscore underscore and then your text. And that's all you need to do to say this text would be translated if I've got a suitable translation table and a translation engine configured. There's a few different, I'm not going to go through them all, there's quite a few different ones, I'll just give 3 examples. So this one here just says translate the text. This one here, the underscore x, is where you might want to interpolate some variables into that. And of course, when you're doing your translation tables, you're not necessarily going to know what those variables are going to contain, so this is just a way of having some fairly sane translation tables that you can still insert some values. And the way that it works, you can probably work that out in the notation. You just give the text you want to display, the variables that you want to interpolate into there, and what the values of those should be. And then the final one is where you want to deal with plurals. So this, you might want to say, but I'm not, yeah, so you might want to just say one file, there's only one, or if you've got 5 files, then you might want to put an S on the end. And the way that works is you give 2 different translations, or 2 different texts. One is a singular, one is a plural, and then pass it the number there, and it'll automatically pick which one to use. And I didn't actually know this, but apparently in some languages, singular is used for what I would call plural. So that'll do all that for you, and you can figure that in your own translation tables.
For 2, 3, 4, because we have for every number we have different.
Okay, I mean, as I understand it, that will handle it. To be honest, I'm not. I mean, the reason I'm talking about translations is because I know it's possible and it all sort of ties in. I have to confess that I do use these, but I haven't actually done any translating in anger. So what I do know is that it's quite comprehensive and it does work quite well from having spoken to other people. So hopefully it covers that. If it might not, I think I'm fairly confident it would. Like I said, by default, there's no translations. But the point being that what I do now when I do my web applications is I just automatically put all these underscores in. It's very little overhead, and I just know at some point in the future, if I want to translate this website to another language, I just extract all this text, which you can do easily. I'll get someone else to translate it for me, generate some locale files, and that's everything done for my website translated. So what we were looking at then was translations within the code. Of course, a lot of the time you're going to be having your text in a template, and so there's methods to do that as well. There's 3 or 4 different ways of doing that. I've just picked out a couple. And this is for Template Toolkit. I don't know whether other templating engines are supported. So for Template Toolkit, you just use a filter, the lock filter, standing for localization. And that'll do the filtering for you. And you can still do all the other things that I talked about, such as inserting variable names if you want to, and that's the second example. There's a, sorry, I've got it on the next slide. And again, there's tools to help you extract this data from the template. So you extract all the templates information, that'll extract, in this case, the translating police text, and then you can translate that. What I was going to do a demo of this morning, what I realised that's missing actually is this is something that should go in the plugin, so that's something I'm going to go away and look at. So you also need to tell the Template Toolkit doesn't by default include that filter, so you need to configure that filter for the Template Toolkit. It just occurred to me this morning, actually, that would be nice if the plugin just did all that for you automatically. Like I said, the text needs to be extracted, so you get it from the template and from the source file, and then send it to someone to translate or translate to yourself. To add a translator, you use some code that look like this. I mean, it looks fairly complicated, but given that will turn on translating for all your code, I think that's quite good. You just load the relevant modules, and you just configure that for a particular translator. And the way that it works is that, I've never really played with translation files, but so this may be more familiar to some of you, but the way it works is you give it a path to some messages, so you can have lots of different translation tables in there, and it'll pick the appropriate one out for the appropriate language. And that will happen automatically. So all you have to do is have those particular keywords to say you want this text to be translated, you have the translation tables, and then you add a translation engine, and that's everything done. So just to give an example, you might set your localization variable to be Dutch. It'll look for that particular Dutch translation set in those messages files, and then it'll try and translate. But as you might have guessed, you can actually do that on a dispatcher level. So if you've got, so I talked about dispatchers earlier, which is where you can send your messages. So if you've got your messages being sent to a syslog and to the user, you can set one of them to be translated, one of them not to be. So if I was translating my website to Chinese, I'd want to get the error messages myself in the syslog in English, but of course I want the messages to the user to be translated, and you can just override that just with that one line. So I'm just going to go a quick demonstration. So I've got a very simple application here. I go to my home page, and that's displaying a warning, and I'm displaying that warning just by at the top there. So I'm displaying that warning just by saying warning, and that's automatically being sent to the template, and now I'm displaying it in the template. And like I say, I'm using that's a bootstrap widget, if you like, and it's automatically doing the colour coding. So for a couple of lines of code, I'm easily sending messages to the user. To give them a couple of examples, I'm going to my settings page, and I'm also displaying a notice, so warning and a notice. And again, to do that, very simple code in the settings route. That's the line. I've just got two things in here. So this could be in any module that uses log reports. I've got a warning there, and I notice the first one's translated, the second one isn't. So that's just sending simple messages. I also talked about catching user errors. So I've got a simple submit button on my page here. So let's say this is a form and I've just submitted an email address. First of all, let's say I've submitted a valid one, and that brings back a nice success message. If I now go into my code and set an error, so let's say I tested a valid email address and I didn't like it, I just called the error keyword. That's all I need to call. Submit that again, and then I get the invalid email address back. So you can see how easy that is to set errors and catch them and then display them to the user. And then finally, I might have an unexpected error. So I've done some stupid coding here. Obviously, that's going to throw an exception. That wouldn't normally be caught during compile time. So if I run that now. What it does is it automatically, by default, if it's not something you've caught, automatically calls back to the home page. This is running a production version, so it just says to the user unexpected error has occurred. But on my, I thought that might happen. There's actually a bug that, which I know it is, I need to go away and fix it. That would normally display the error message, the exception message in your console, because that's the way it's configured, with the full stack trace. So I see the stack trace, the user sees a nice friendly error message. And finally, one final demonstration. I can then run that with the Dutch locale. My translation table is German, but that's just the way I set it up. That's that message that you were seeing, which was fine the warning. It's now changed to German. Is that the correct German? I don't know. Have I got that correct? Should be fine as well. Is that no?
That's fine.
Okay. I didn't know Dutch, I speak a little bit of German. But anyway, so I've got the translation table in there, and just by setting the locale to my dancer application, that's then translated that for me. So how much time have we got left? No time now.
10 minutes.
Okay, that's good.
Fine.
Yeah. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about some of the more general things. Like I say, every message is an object. These are the two types of objects. You've got log report exception objects, which contain lots of information about the exception, such as the level, such as the reason for the message to call the stack, and some of the other variables that you might want to access. And then the log report message itself contains the string to be translated, the various parameters to be put into that string, and the domain it's a member of. I didn't really talk about domains. That's another level to talk about. It basically allows you to have different translations for different areas of application. A couple of other handy features that I use. Normally when I send my messages to my template, I want to HTML encode them, because the chances are I'm not going to be wanting to put HTML in there. Obviously it's up to you how you do that. What you can do, you can add a class to a message, and I use that to say I have something called a HTML class. And when I set a message, if I set a specific message, and actually I do have some HTML in there that I don't want encoded, I just add it to the HTML class, and then I test that in my template. So, that's obviously really powerful, because there's all sorts of other things you can do. So you can add messages to different classes, and you can test for those different classes when you send the messages. A few other points. One thing I do is I use email notifications on the syslogger. So I have my syslog full of all sorts of information, but what you can do for those who use the syslog is you can set a certain level that you get email notifications for if your messages are above that level. So I set a fairly high threshold for error messages. I set them sort of at the panic level. So I don't get notified about user errors, so that's user fatal errors. But if I get application errors, then I automatically get an email. So what happens is the user gets a nice friendly message, and then I get an email telling me an error has happened, and it's quite often already been fixed by the time the user phones me and says, you've got an error. Just a couple of the points to note. The format of dispatches isn't quite as configurable as I'd like it to be. So if you've got a specific text format for your dispatcher, some of the dispatchers support it, some don't. That's something I'd like a little bit more flexibility on. But you know, if you've got feedback on that, then please give it. And a couple of other points to note is that the dispatchers are global to an application. So you can't, in the case of Dancer, you can't have different dispatchers for different applications. I don't know whether you want to anyway, but that's just an important point to note. And finally, this is something I need to work on in the plugin. At the moment, if you try and use this in a Dancer application with more than one app, it will try and set a second dispatcher and overwrite the first one, which will cause an exception. So that actually won't work at the moment with multiple apps. It's an easy fix, and hopefully that gets me out onto the CPAN in the next couple of days if you do use that. And then finally, I just want to talk about a couple of other ways of doing your logging. And this is just really an example. There could be other things to do. So I use logging in dbik, and what I do is I send all my dbik queries into my dispatchers and then straight to my syslog. So again, this just sort of happens all automatically. There's actually a log report dbik profiler. And all I need to do is, for those that have seen it before, you can actually add a debug object into your dbik schema and get it called something. So all I do is I add the dbik profiler into the dbik debug object, and that produces this automatically. So just with those couple of lines of code, you automatically get what queries it's running, how long they took to run. Once you turn on debugging. This is something else to talk about on dbik, and I'm hoping to talk to Reba about it at some point. What I want to happen is I want dbik exceptions to be treated as application exceptions, because as a general rule, if dbik throws an exception, it's something that I've done wrong in my code, so I want that to be treated above a user error level. The problem I've got, so that's what I would normally do, so I'll tell dbik I want any exception action to be to panic, which will kick off all that stuff I've talked about. The reason that doesn't work at the moment, well, it does work, the problem that has at the moment is that actually dbik does actually throw exceptions in some normal circumstances in there, because these are sort of special, if I can call them that, exceptions, they don't get caught properly. So what you can get if you include this, which I did include in my production code for a while, is you can actually get it dying on stuff that it shouldn't be dying on, stuff that would normally be caught. I need to maybe have a chat with you, Reba, as to ways we can catch that, because that would be quite nice to be able to. So I've covered quite a lot of ground there. If you don't take anything else away, just take away the fact that there's a nice, easy way to do warnings, logging, and user messages. All the examples I've talked through are all in the log report plugin page. So it's Dancer 2 plugin log report. And I think pretty much everything apart from the translations is all in that page in the detail section. So you know, have a peruse of that in slow time. And like I said, I've been using this now in a couple of my more recent applications, and I just find it really, really easy and a lot easier to pass messages around and handle errors. Any questions? No, good. Thank you.